I am so incredibly excited to bring to you the live recording of the panel discussion that took place this past weekend at the inaugural Pennsylvania Antique Show. I was honored to have been asked to moderate this conversation that centered around antiques and collecting, particularly how to engage a younger generation. And the group of people that you are about to hear from are so incredibly passionate, knowledgeable. I was blown away and so honored to share a stage with them. You'll hear from Michael Diaz-Griffith, Matthew Monk, and Lisa Minardi. Enjoy.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Allie. I am really excited about this conversation. You'll likely be drawn to an object, probably in this crowd, and they're necessarily because it's rare or because it is perfect, although many are pretty darn close, but because they have presence. And you'll talk to the dealers, you'll learn everything has a story. And I think that's really where our conversation starts today. You just heard we have a wide variety of perspectives here today. We have material culture, we have history, we have design, and so I think I'm gonna launch, as one does in a public forum, with a somewhat personal question and ask all three of you if you could start by letting us know an object in the first place and then also what you collect.
Shall we start in this direction? All right. What draws me to an object? Well, I would say, first of all, that objects contain stories, and I want to acknowledge the dealers in this room because I think they're the great storytellers in this material culture world who exist, beyond the walls of museums. Although we love our museums, but in a casino on a Saturday morning, you guys are getting ready to tell stories about our history and the history of material culture. So, of course, we love the stories that are in objects, and I love the people who activate those stories. That's always been a very self-evident part of the attraction of collecting to me, that you're going to connect with other people who are going to share history with you, interpret objects, and help to unfold them for you through discussion. In terms of the nuances of what I collect mostly American material. I love reverse painted glass portraits, which Pat Bell sometimes helps me find at auction. They're very affordable. Love that, most of them were produced for the export market, and you'll have these wonderful examples that are like, Lafayette or Washington or a figure, like a Swiss maiden. And they were being made basically on an assembly line in Canton and painting them, but they were, painting them in a serial fashion. And I love finding like a Washington that's cross-eyed, or finding a Lafayette who's like weirdly scratched their nose, and so they miss the hair. And that's an example of the kind of thing I love looking for. I care a lot about quality and condition and provenance, and I do think about those things in the context of the furniture that I buy, which is mostly American. I love American painted furniture. I love that the Americana world cares so much about surface and condition. Really fun thing to think about and explore and talk about, and I love the seriousness of it. But at the end of the day, things that are unusual, rare, that bear the traces of condition, chance, accidents, are fascinating to me because they have embedded in them those stories, and then I love that we can share them.
Amazing. Matthew?
Well, gosh, Michael, you stole my answer.
It's a meeting of the minds.
No. I guess what I'm interested in an object depends on sort of what hat I'm wearing at the moment. So, in personal collecting, which is a little bit limited because of my professional responsibilities, both in collections policies and also because of the ethical mandates of the American Museum Association. So what I collect is often related to what I'm researching at the moment. So because I'm finishing my dissertation for dissertation research on the Appalachian craft revival, and while there are archives of those things and there are collections of objects, there aren't a lot of them, and they're not necessarily as representative of the quotidian things that I'm researching. I'm actually looking at the intersection of sort of handmade craft revival and tourism. So I personally collect for my own research a kind of aesthetic collecting that's looking for the intersections of like camp, maybe a type of sort of propaganda through design a little bit. And so I collect a lot of Western North Carolina, Southern Appalachian, very early craft tchotchkes might be the best term for it. They're cool for me as a very newly employed, still current grad student, who's working on having resources to think about what I might collect as a big boy. But this has been a very accessible kind of collecting for me that's actually created my own internal archive of which I'm able to sort of write about and sort of explore. And so when I'm actually thinking about what I value and look for, it is often the quirky or the accident or the, and it's sort of, yeah, that's, I look for things that are a little odd or a little unusual, familiar at the same time.
So I totally get what you're saying about dissertation-related collecting, having just defended mine, which was a look at the Germans in colonial Philadelphia, not Germantown, but Philadelphia proper. And chapter 5 is sort of how did this huge population disappear? And I found myself scouring eBay collecting of Avon products that were Pennsylvania Dutch tollware inspired bright yellow plastic containers, and there's a illustration of them in chapter 5. So you'll have to buy the book when it comes out, hopefully next year, to see them. But so I totally get that. But in the real world, so for me personally, so I have a 1750s house that my late husband, Philip Bradley, who was an antique stealer, and I restored, and I was finally able to move into that in the fall of 2021. And it's kind of a big house, and so I found that a lot of the things that Philip actually had in inventory, I decided to keep. I was a very bad antique stealer. I'm really a collector and a curator at heart. And so I, filled the house with kind of 1750 to 1800 Pennsylvania and Philadelphia furniture. But I love color. I absolutely love color. And I was ecstatic when we actually found polka dot paint that was original to the house, blue polka dots. And so I really like the color blue, and that's something that's certainly come out, I think, in the house with some of the painted Pennsylvania German furniture and the Fraktur. But then with my museum director hat on, and what we focus on for historic traps. So of course we're interested in, our local town history and, writ large, from the beginning when we were founded in 1717 until, what's happening yesterday and today in the town. So we have to be responsible for all of that. We have the Muhlenberg family who, lived in trap and were so American history. So we're always interested in objects related to them, and not just from the 18th century part of the family, but can't legacy forward and document. And then we also focus on Montgomery County objects, Philadelphia area things, the types of things used to furnish the Muhlenberg's homes in Trout. And then with our Center for Pennsylvania German Studies, we cast an even broader net and look to try to really represent that community. So we have things from all over southeastern Pennsylvania. And then we look comparatively at, how does this Pennsylvania German folk art or more refined art, we have Philadelphia Chippendale chairs made by Pennsylvania German craftsmen for the Muhlenberg family. So you would never look at them and think, oh, that's a Pennsylvania German chair. Typically, in my dissertation, you'll understand more about why they really are. But so we also have like Quaker furniture, we have Linenbury inlay, we have all kinds of things, to set that comparative context for the material that we collect.
Especially everyone is. I think it's interesting that themes I hear with other groups of young collectors, I'm hearing here, as specialized as you are too, deeply contextual, deeply personal, colorful, unusual, rare, affordable. Like that's a really interesting.
And I'm glad you brought that up because those answers were not at all what I was bracing for, but I love them all very much. I would love actually to have you elaborate on that because I was going to ask, as someone who has studied and talked about new collectors, right? Young collectors, changed. Has it always looked this way?
It certainly has not always looked this way. And, as many in the audience know, we've been living through some dark times. So in the introduction to my book, I kind of sketched that out. But I entered this field, the antiques boom of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, depending on whom you're talking to, had gone bust, and it was a really interesting time to be entering the field. I think we all probably feel that way because, there has been some demoralization, let's say, and a sense that the golden age has passed. And as someone who was so excited about building my future in the arena of antiques and material culture, it could be a little bit unhappy making at times to think that there was this air of negativity or pessimism around the thing that I loved and that I had aspired to be a part of all my life. So after that sort of immediate sense of alarm passed, I really began looking for signs of life among younger people, historic art, material culture, antiques, and I found it. But I didn't always find it in the places where we would think to look in our world. So, I was working at the Winter Show. I had worked at fairs previously and that were specialized in antiques and historic art. And we knew that there wasn't a sort of healthy new generation of collectors emerging at the upper end of the market. We were all aware of that. So I was looking elsewhere to see where it was happening. And I was finding in fashion, in the world of design, in the world of style, that millennials were interested in color and pattern and historicity and complexity and storytelling, but they just hadn't matriculated up to the sort of level of wealth required to have the discretionary income to buy at fairs like the ones we're at today. And my premise was really that, which I won't bore you with in full, but was that Gen X is the missing generation. I'm not generalizing, so for any Gen X people in the audience, you're cool, you're a part of this, and we love you. But really it was baby boomers who drove the antiques boom. And their children, I'm gonna say this as a millennial, were a disappointment. They did not follow in the footsteps of their parents. And it's funny because Love Story, the JFK Jr., Carolyn Bessette Kennedy show just aired, and everyone's obsessed with the 90s in mass culture. The 90s revival, as you know, has been happening for quite a while in youth culture, but it finally hit mass culture. And it's funny because the moment that show crystallizes, Tribeca in the late 90s, minimalism, Calvin Klein, mid-century modern collecting, and indeed mid-century being kind of brought into the pantheon of the antique, that is what was happening instead of collecting historic art and antiques, because those people were rebelling against their parents had the Park Avenue and the Fifth Avenue apartments with the gorgeous English furniture that we love, and they sort of rebelled. But unfortunately, as we all know, that created a negative impact on this market. But millennials, the next generation down, I could tell were interested. They just couldn't necessarily buy yet. So to make a long story short, over the past decade of observing this, I have seen millennials begin buying, and more importantly, in fashion, in culture, in design magazines, every single year, you see more and more antique and vintage material being used by designers, by young promote collecting and antiques and historic art. And if you really look at the pages of a Shelter magazine today versus even 5 years ago, you will see massively more antiques being deployed, designers. And if you're on the right parts of Instagram, you will see 12-year-olds in Indonesia talking about historic art and antiques. I mean, there is a total sea change. Do they all shop at this level yet? No. So a part of my work is helping those people understand this stuff, and you can afford it if you come out and you meet dealers, you develop relationships and understand what this really is, because there's a way for everybody to start collecting.
Could I add something to
I was
that?
going to say, did anyone want to chime in?
Yeah, so I think that there's nothing new under the sun in design and style world, right? The chicken and the egg, nobody will ever know which came first. But I will say, working at Winterthur and investigating H.F. DuPont's early collecting style and his professionalization as a collector, he's doing exactly that, right? He's actually rejecting the Gilded Age import furniture of H.A. DuPont and the Gilded Age generation, and he's not alone in that. He's pretty of young people who are actually expressing their modernism with a capital M through the use and the reuse of old things, right? So it is modern, it is youthful, but in a way that is not nostalgic. It's actually repurposing old things in a very modern way. So like what Winterthur is, what the house is, what the huge 175 rooms of Winterthur is not actually a historic home in the sense that it actually gets turned into by the end of his life. And when it does professionalize, it's actually when he's living in it, he's actually creating modern environments that he's decorating and styling with antiques. And then he's using textiles. He's using textiles to tie those things together, right? So he's actually taking historic textiles, having them, we would not do this today, but they also didn't have the mechanisms in place to have reproduction textiles. Mrs. Brunswick wasn't yet in the United States. And so they were actually buying old textiles, sometimes dresses, because it's selvage to selvage silk lengths, and then using that to reupholster furniture. So it's not necessarily, it is authenticity of material, not accuracy of presentation.
This is so relevant. We did not plan this. This is so relevant because the interest in antiques and historic art that we see developing among younger people is in part aesthetic, right? There are a lot of people who love maximalist interiors right now. Antiques go well in them. But the deeper vein of interest relates to authenticity. And in an AI age, in 3 years, our world is going to look completely different. I mean, I just read an article this morning. Amazon, will most likely be run entirely by robots. And I mean physical robots and automation within 3 years. And our society is in for a big plot twist that we won't discuss now, but one of the interesting possibilities within it, things that humans have made, human making, authenticity, craftsmanship will become more and more and more important in a world that is becoming increasingly automated. And I already see signs of that. Gen Z is less online and they're less addicted to social media than millennials were. They're trying to find a vein of authentic living and of human being in a very digital world that is slipping away in some regards. And I think, we can think about antiques in the frame, think about them in, and see, the pendulum swinging back and forth and things getting better or worse for the market, but there's a much bigger story happening for humanity in terms of our relationship to technology, and material culture can be, in some sense, the silver lining in that story, where we turn to the material culture world to kind of regain contact with what is most human, which is making things.
Yeah, I want to jump in here. I mean, we're totally seeing that trend. I know at Historic Trap and with the educational programs we offer. So we've been doing, more like adult education workshops, theorem painting, sgraffito plates, in redware. They sell out instantly. I mean, people are absolutely crazy about these. Even like our hearth cooking programs, everybody wants this hands-on experience. And so that's been really interesting to observe that trend with us. And it's, for me, it's very full circle, because I got interested as an 8-year-old when my mom sent me to Colonial Crafts Day Camp. It was making fracture and making theorem paintings and, a horrible little stool that I still have that I, made. And but that hands-on thing, and, look what I built. And it was so, not technology driven. And so we're definitely, I think, seeing that a lot. And I also, in my own house, which, some of my, millennial age friends, they come in and they're afraid to sit in a chair at first because everything is period. And I'm like, no, like, this is not a museum. I live here. Everything in this house you can sit in. It's fine. It's not going to melt. It's not going to break. This isn't Winterthur there. But here it's okay. And, it's interesting because they comment and like, oh, it's not at all what I expected. It's warm, it's welcoming. Like, they seem to think that, if they're not really initiated yet, that it's going to be dark, gloomy and stiff and dull. And then they're really surprised to find like a real stuff and enjoys it. Yeah. And so I'm really trying, to tell them, and also saying, look, like, this is, it's a buyer's market. I mean, there's terrific stuff out there to find. And the uniqueness of it, that there's the craftsmanship, but also it's not, all the IKEA stuff or kit furniture that's like all the same. It's really unique and special, and and that you can have this, so that accessibility and that you can bring this into your life. I'm really trying to preach that, I know, to my friends and colleagues.
Yeah.
There's two other things that come up that I just thought about, which is there's types of anxiety that I think we're in moments of societal anxiety that happens, and I want to tie that to sort of colonial revival and why we care about Americana. This is also related to my dissertation. Sorry, you all did not come to my TED Talk, but here we go. The anxieties about sort of immigration, America's ascendancy as a superpower, our ascendancy as an industrial power, and the anxieties about industrialization and perhaps the loss or forgetting of a handmade past, and the anxieties around that, that's very much in the air circa 1880 to 1920, when folks like HF and Electra Havermeyer-Webb are starting to collect Americana and folk art and things that are sort of down market, as it were. And they're buying those things on the cheap, but they're also creating the stories behind them. And that is, they're using nostalgia, dare I say, as a kind of a way to deal with social anxieties, good and bad, right? So they're using it as a kind of a social salve in a sense, and it is a flavor of modernity. That's the other thing that's really interesting about sort of collecting, and you see it represented in the booths here today that you'll walk through. There's different ways of expressing your connectivity to a past and also your presence in the present. Whether it's by collecting furniture from the 1970s or furniture from the 1770s. And so you have a way to sort of show your intelligence and awareness of a broader, longer history, while also then living with it in a way that is also very contemporary. And it both projects your intelligence of a thing, but also sort of your awareness of where it sits in a contemporary sense. And so living with antiques versus the type of collecting that Lisa and I do for our institutions are two completely different things, and one is not divorced from the other and never has been. And so our industry, the historic house and museum field, has existed with our dealer friends, right, to really show people how things were used in the past, but also how people can live with them in the present. And that's always been the case.
And I think it's really important to remind ourselves that, the past didn't end. We're still living in history, and I love thinking about historic material culture as a bunch of unfinished ideas. We're still contributing to the ideas embedded in those objects through our collecting practices. And the stories that are embedded in them continue today. We become a part of those stories when we collect. And, I think that expressing that to wider audiences is a really important thing, because, and not going to Donahue's for steak, although I love it. They're not, dressing conservatively. Antiques are our, sort of cultural patrimony writ large. It's for, an inheritance that we all share. You don't have to look a certain way to find interest in it, and you don't have to be a certain way to become a part of the story. So I think a lot of what happens when we see real growth again in the market, as millennials come into their body, different types of people are collecting, and that they're displaying their collections in ways that we hadn't imagined. And that has to be okay, because that's how this field expands again, what we're expecting, but that's a sign of growth.
I don't even know what point to go with, but one thing that I'm...
Just wind us up. And we'll
there's a lot to pull from here. One thing that I kind of heard across all three of you speaking was, we kind of, I don't want to say we came into this conversation, how do we engage young collectors? But we kind of came into this conversation saying, how do we engage young collectors? But it sounds like young collectors are engaged. They just don't realize it in the sense that we're talking about it. And because I'm a marketing gal, and I know there are some dealers in the audience, I'm curious if we could have a conversation about, because you also all work with audiences of all ages, you work on the interpretation side, what could dealers be doing to engage the collectors that are out there? I don't know that our conversation is so much, how do we get young people to keep this going? It sounds like that interest is there. How do dealers draw this audience in?
Well, I care about my life, so I will never make a prescriptive statement to dealers, ever, okay? I want to continue living. But I do think that, I'm just going to give one piece of wisdom that's derived from working in this vein for years, which is that the answers are complex and they're deeply personal. So it depends on what kind of dealer you are. It depends on what your hunger is to really reach into another era. If you're the kind of dealer, very successful business during the antiques boom, and you never felt like you had to struggle to reach an audience, or if it all felt like it came naturally during that period, I mean, obviously through a ton of hard work, right? And relationship-driven dealing, but it was positive and it didn't feel like a struggle. And now you're saying, I'm just exhausted. I don't want to chase that audience. I don't have an interest in figuring out what's coming in 10 years. I spend a lot of time telling people that's okay. You don't have to necessarily force it. You can find a way to pass the business on. You can find a way to, sort of wind it down. Going to let down the field. Like, it's okay. This should be fun. It should be fun. At the same time, if you decide that you want to pursue the future, you have to understand no tagline will fix it. We've all sat in committee meetings. Can we explain what a given show is or a house museum if we just change our tagline? Or if we just refine the logo? Or if the Instagram posts are just a little bit better? And while those things are important, they do have to happen. They have to happen in a way that actually reaches the audience. So you actually have to be looking and listening for signals about what people really want. It can't just be your idea of what people want that you're cooking up in the abstract. It has to be connected to the heartbeat of culture. And even if you have the most amazing tagline or new logo or new website, it's not like any single action is going to fix it. It's going to be years of doing that and also cultivating new audiences and doing things that are maybe uncomfortable, whether it's doing a new show or doing something really outrageous, like loaning a fashion designer works that they can use in their show that a new audience will see in a different context. It takes all those, I think, to really push a business into this future that we're discussing. But if you get a taste for it, if you want to create a multi-generational or to continue a multi-generational business, I know the opportunity is there, and the pendulum does always swing. We can see those signals across our culture. And that's why I dress like this instead of in a suit. I love suits, but a big part of my job is to communicate to people downtown in New York and in Brooklyn and in Milan that this stuff that we're doing today, it belongs to our wider culture. Fashion people should come and buy. This isn't just for a rarefied group or a niche. And so everyone has to come to their own answer, but there's not one silver bullet for it. It's about a practice.
I think that, so again, I'm not going to tell dealers what dealers should do, but we are part of a large symbiotic community, and we help one another in a bunch of really fundamental ways. And I think things like Fine Object Society are starting to do some of that work to sort of foster and help younger people feel comfortable in our collective worlds and feel like they're a part of it there yet. It gives them access and it helps platform them and feel like they've got a kind of a leg up into what can be sometimes a very intimidating field if you don't come from inside of it already or didn't grow up inside of it. And so I think that's great. One of the other things that I think could be a good is to create ways inside of your all's community to sort of platform and elevate younger dealers of a variety of levels, right? Not just at the upper echelons, but having entry level and mid-career level, right? Having people on the ascendancy. Very powerful example of how a small locally focused collector can really build a business for himself out of really a childhood and family passion. And so, I think Jeffrey Ricketts is the hope for the future. Dare I say? I did a panel
with him at Colonial Williamsburg, and he was still a child. And then and now he's got like a child. It's amazing how fast things.
And thank you for mentioning Jeffrey. We definitely wanted to make an effort with this show in particular. That this is we want to of collectors as well as dealers. Because we need to have great shows like this 10 years, 20 years from now. So that was super important to us. And I'll just say, with Historic Trap, one of the things that I really love is that we're a big enough museum that we have some staff. It's not just me anymore, but we're also small enough to be, very nimble and flexible. And I'm not sure I've ever advertised for a job yet, because of mouth recruiting or finding people who come to us as interns, which, they just email us, they knock on the door, whatever, they come for a tour and we're like, hey, you seem like you're interested. What are you doing this summer? It's very much like word of mouth kind of recruiting that we've had. But like our social media manager, Keegan, who's here somewhere, he came to us as an intern last year from Ursinus and fit with us and clicked, and it took a little bit for me to adjust to it, but I really trust that you've got a good sense of this vibe. I'm gonna let you run with it, and and not taking ourselves so seriously. So I'll put this out there, like, I don't know what you think. I was like, this is great. I nearly fell out of my chair laughing. Go ahead and put it out there. So, we're trying not to take ourselves so seriously and be so stuffy that we can't have fun and laugh and enjoy these things.
And that's authenticity.
Yes.
It's related to what we were talking about, that point about dealers, because we have some wonderful representatives of our dealers committee from the Winter Show here today, longstanding members of that committee. And I'm working right now in the strategic planning process at the Winter Show with Eastside House, our owner and beneficiary, to try to advocate for doing more in the future to support the dealer community specifically, because we talk a lot about collectors, but if you project 5 or 10 years into the future, if we don't have viable young dealers today, we're going to literally run out of dealers who can populate these fairs, because some of you guys do need to retire eventually for you at a beach, eventually, And so there's a community of dealers who can push this forward for decades to come. It's a critically important thing.
And I do want to talk continuity in a minute, because that is a very important part of this conversation. I want to just first go back, Lisa, to what you were saying about not taking yourself too seriously at times, because I think we could all agree intimidation is a big part of why perhaps people are not collecting or are not considering themselves a collector. And so I would love to hear a little bit more from all of you about what barriers you think people are facing to accessing collecting. Intimidation is one of them, which we've kind of already named, but do you see other things keeping people away, or even elaborating on the intimidation factor?
Everyone's looking at me.
You had such a great anecdote about social media.
Yeah, well, I think, for me, I remember, vividly, like, working as a winter curator, and, don't touch this, don't do that, don't sit here, and then, sitting on top of a high chest, adjusting the lights in his booth. And at first I was shocked, my little curator heart was like, oh my God, it's going to break, what is he doing? And then I thought, he's probably been doing this for decades, I just didn't know it. Probably lots of people have sat on this or done crazy things, and I'm not encouraging you to go out and break things, but I'm saying, you gain a certain comfort level when you're handling this stuff all the time and when you live with it. And then I definitely try to model that, with my own collecting in my house, as I was saying, like when I entertain, it's like, sit in the couch, sit in the chairs, come on, we're going to sit at this table, it is not going to break, and just trying to get over that maybe fear that museums beat into us about, we can't touch these objects.
Velvet rope, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a couple of thoughts on this. I think I think that for me it's all about accessibility and the broad categories of accessibility, and I try to address a wide range of audiences. So for me it's about breaking down the kind of ivory tower intimidation that a place like Winterthur has, both in terms of the scale and scope of the place, the legacy of who HF was as a collector in the field, which can sometimes in and of itself be intimidating. Although when I'm in the collections and I think about him as a collector, I actually see his humanity, and I see him actually developing as a collector in a way that actually makes him very relatable in a way that I very much enjoy. So I really visit and learn about stuff. It's you can see his joy in collecting, and you can see his competitiveness too, which is really fun. But I do think that, so what I try to do, there's a time and a place for fancy and formal, and that has overall been the trajectory of our field, to be a little suited up. But I come from a very blue-collar background, and so the way that I approach access to my part of the collection is very, come see me. I will meet you where you are. I don't expect you to meet me where I'm at, and I want to create rungs on the ladder to help you get to whatever level you want to be of knowledge, right? So if you're interested in textiles because you're into interior design and you really like color and pattern, that's great. Let's talk about aesthetics. Let's talk about the design. Let's talk about the visual language of it all. If you're really interested in the structure and the science and the material science, get the XRF out and find out what that dye is. Let's look at that thing under a microscope. If you have a place where you can step away from your overworked job and find peace and joy in looking at things that were made by people in the past, to understand a slow making practice where you've created a kind of an analog practice in a virtual world, I'm here for you for that. So I work a lot with the American Quilt Study Group. They're the national and international quilt.
But I'm 40, we're not spring chickens actually. You are.
No,
We're not, yeah. Yeah, and so if you think back to what a 40-year-old was doing, 20 years ago, they were considered a fully fledged adult. And we are. I've been working for 20 years. I mean, I've been working since I was 15, but
I'm a baby.
Yeah, there we go. So I'm saying Adam looks very young. He has one of the most successful interior design businesses, and he buys real antiques. I mean, he buys from Gallery Kugel monthly. If his clients can afford Kugel, they can afford everything here. When I walk him around the show, he was treated like a child, and he looks young. I get it. You have to know who it is, though. You have to study. If you're going to sell to people who are wealthy today or working with the wealthy today, you have to be able to recognize them. So I think it's important for us to both create accessibility and engage in democratic outreach and make things fun and authentic. But if you want a killer business, you also need to understand where the potential clients are and cultivate them. And they may not be who you think they are.
I often, actually, to build off of that, I often hear from people of all parts of our larger community about sort of how people aren't interested in collecting, or the death of Brownwood, or nobody's interested in doing things this way anymore. And I find that very frustrating from a professional point of view and also a personal point of view. And I do see the dip in sort of sales, the dip in interest, the dip in my side of the world in terms of membership and ticket sales sometimes. And what I really want to push people to do across our whole community is to really recognize what that actually is, right? And you, again, it's sort of back to what I said a minute ago. You can't expect people to come to you where you're at. You have to create reasons for people to want to engage. You can't just say, well, it's always been done this way, and then expect it to always be that way on its own. You have to be willing to question and critique and reevaluate not just the sale of stuff, but also sort of like what gets people to come through the door to Historic House. Like, you have to create meaning, and sort of value is a subjective category, whether it is a financial value, whether it's a cultural value, whether it's a social value. All of those things are subjective, and they change all the time because society and people change all the time. So we do need to reevaluate as a whole community that's focused around sort of a love and a concern for older objects. We need to reevaluate not just what we're doing, but also who and how we are addressing those things too, right? So when I'm putting together a show, I'm coverlet bear on Instagram, and I care immensely about hand woven and figured in fancy coverlets, but me and about 20 other people. And so, like, even though I know a lot about those things, and I could absolutely put a show that I would think would be the best show in the world, it doesn't have the sort of cultural capital right now to really do that kind of work in a way that would sort of warrant the investment in a show. And you have to be kind of aware, I think. I mean, even though talking about museums or the educational work that we do as a business doesn't always seem like a nice thing, we are nonprofit corporations, and we do have to actually sell memberships and tickets to keep the lights on, but also people want to engage with. And I have to create reasons and for them to do that.
This is why I like to talk about, the fashion business or design often, because they are aware that they have to be desirable for the clients. And we do too. It's just a part of it. I mean, the foundation can be deep geekery. I mean, there's no one more geeky than this group on stage, but you have to also be able to communicate the desirability of these things. And we often talk in New York about Chanel as a touchstone for, well-run luxury corporation. But I noticed that when we're talking about it in like a winter show context where there's a deep association with Chanel, we're often talking about the Chanel of the 90s. Chanel today is run on completely different business principles than the Chanel. Then we have to look at what they're doing today. And actually, one of the happy things is they focus more on craftsmanship today in their marketing than they did in the 90s. In the 90s, about craftsmanship. So me saying that we need to make sure that we're following sort of modern business practices, it doesn't mean that they need to be debased. In some cases, it may mean we need to throw open the doors and shine more light on topics that we already love. We just have to do it in new ways. And you're a great example of that.
Well, thank you. My least favorite that floats around is also sustainability, which I'm sure everyone here just loves. But I feel like you're hitting the nail on the head with this craftsmanship, sustainability, a younger generation valuing those things, probably also because we have been shoved so much of the opposite. As a millennial, I mean, that's all I know, right? And so I'm curious how I'm getting a little, I'm going back to design here for 1 second because I think this is an important part of the conversation. You come from a world of design. You work in a house known for its design. You are doing interpretation and design. So how does design play into all of this? You've touched on the interior designer as a connector.
Yeah. I'm actually not a design, and I've practiced before, but I sort of went into it as an activist for antiques. I thought, if I can take over the design world and make them look at antiques a bunch, that'll help with this other. So I'm on a little bit of a mission. And honestly, so are a lot of other people. There are a lot of interior designers who are taking it as their mission to introduce their clients to antiques and historic art, to guide them through the process of buying. And while there was a dip for a while and there were fewer designers who were doing that, we're seeing, I think, once again, the designer becoming the friend of the dealer, the friend of historic material culture who helps their clients get into contact with that world. And it's when dealers forge connections with those designers, Adam is a great example, the results are positive for everyone. They're positive for the dealer, the designer has better resources, the clients end up being initiated into our world, and it's a very healthy thing. I'll say, since you kind of spoke to the sustainability idea, I often have sat in on meetings where people say that antiques are sustainable and young people like sustainable and therefore they'll like them. And, I'm always said, yeah, a lot of younger people do care about that, but often in the Venn diagram between people who care about sustainability and people who pay a lot of money for beautiful things, like there's not a ton of overlap. There sometimes is, but I think that even for people who care about sustainability, the presence of the object, its beauty, its stories to the fore when they're buying. And so it's sort of an ambient message that we should not give up on, but that's not the magic code that causes people to want these things. It really is a little bit more about the mockingbird principle. They still have to see something, and I know that there's so much on the show floor today to attract that kind of attention.
I think design is at the heart of the history of what we do. It's where it came from. It's the story of how it was professionalized. If you look at the history of historic house museums in the United States, they're as much about learning about how people lived in the past as they are about selling you how to decorate your dining room. And I'm not joking, in a very real sense. So think about Ernest Lonano, who is the upholsterer at Winterthur. He designs all the curtains and does all of the upholstery. His father the interiors for the Met's American Wing for their period rooms in the 20s. He does the period rooms for the PMA when they first get period rooms. And then HF, working with Bertha Bankert, this socialite New Yorker, early interior designer, a la Elsie DeWolf, they work together to create, it's all about living with your antiques. People are collecting to live with them, not necessarily, and they're learning how to collect by going to the period rooms and by going, so like museums that have Americana early on in the 20s, people are going to those to learn how to collect Americana as much as they are to learn about the history of the objects and the people that made them. And then they're going out to their local antique shops buying things that look like Hepplewhite chairs because they now have knowledge, and then they're going to historic houses to see how to decorate with them. And so Franco Scalamandre and Ernest Lonano work toe and toe together. Scalamandre donates all the fabric, Lonano does all the curtains to spec, and they go across all of the historic house museums in the Midwest and East Coast. And I would say even today, people that visit Winterthur, it's probably 50-50, maybe 60-40 between the people that come and actually see the rooms and things. What they're taking out of those rooms is the history, but they're also taking away a sense of style, a sense of taste, a sense of how to scale that to their own lives. How do we take the Chinese parlor at Winterthur with its incredible wallpaper and its thousands of Chippendale chairs, and how do we distill that dining room or somebody's formal parlor in 2026? That's what people are doing. That's how they're engaging with the site as much as they are with our high-level nerdery and connoisseurial knowledge about who made what and who their kids were.
But I want to say that is where the antiques revival is right now.
Yes.
It's in that getting inspired, loving to look at it, seeing it on Pinterest, seeing it on Instagram. And I always try to point out in these conversations that collecting was never really a young person's game. So yes, aesthetes, yes, socialites, gay men, I don't know. There were some people who started collecting at birth and in their 20s, but in the sort of boom period we were talking about, people were going to these house museums in their 20s, 30s. You might have inherited furniture from your parents or been given hand-me-downs as you start your life independently. Then when your kids go off to boarding school or college, you really start collecting in earnest, coming to shows, befriending dealers. That point at which people during the sort of boom times began collecting seriously happened at about the age we are now on this stage. And that's when the real collecting practice began. And the millennials that we're talking about who have this interest are about our age. The cusp now of this entire generation matriculating into its buying power and having the ability to begin collecting higher quality material in earnest. But the design inspiration often comes first. And we're there. I mean, that is what you see, I think, every day on Instagram, because now they need to really begin learning so they can really begin buying.
And I would just add that many of the conversations I have, specialists of all sorts of, ongoing themes of that conversation that I have over and over and over again is that people are curious, right? They learn about the podcast because of my Instagram page. They stick around because we're having these ongoing conversations that they're afraid to ask, or that no one is putting out there for them anywhere else. And so they're seeing these beautiful pictures in veranda and wherever else. And so it's like, how do I, if I'm not hiring this interior designer, how do I access this?
Yeah, and learn about it.
And learn more and purchase. Is this our time check?
It's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to everybody.
Oh gosh, that was amazing. Thank you all so much for that wonderful discussion. So informative, fun, and funny as well.